Aloha and happy Earth Day. Welcome to April 20th. It's our final event of the semester, and of course it's on a historic day. We're commemorating Earth Day, but while we're meeting here, we can actually see on the live webcast in New York that they're actually looking right now at the closing of the Paris Agreement and the signing. And so today we're going to be looking first at the Paris Agreement and climate change. We're going to be looking at from a local perspective and here also in the Pacific. So we're fortunate to have Victoria Keener here with us from the East-West Center. She's going to be looking at future and current climate projections and policy impacts in Hawaii and small island states. So that's how we'll start off the event. Then we also have people that were actually in Paris doing the negotiations and participating. So they'll be sharing their stories about what they were working on. And then we'll be looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as that is a major part of the Paris Agreement, looking at how each state has agreed to take action to meet these 17 goals and how they also interconnect with the Paris Agreement and all those details. So we're fortunate enough to have everyone here today while everything's going on in New York City. Over 150 countries have already signed, so that's historic. But what's most important is to look at how it'll impact Hawaii, but also small island states, and what we can do in the future. So this is really the beginning of all the work that needs to be done, and I'd like to welcome Victoria and thank her so much for coming.
Thank you. Happy to talk on this historic occasion. We'll see exactly how historic it is in the next year or so, and we'll get to a couple of the policy implications with the signing of the agreement. So a little bit of background on me first. I am not a policy person. My background is actually in hydroclimatological engineering. Kind of a strange fit, but the program that, the grant that I lead, the research program in the East-West Center is the Pacific RISA program, or Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments, and it's an interdisciplinary grant that looks at how to translate climate information being done at that research level into actionable adaptation and translation into policy. So it's really working with stakeholders, working with both physical and social scientists. So I've gotten more comfortable in the social science world and in the policy world kind of as an effect of this. So what I'll be talking about today is some very general trends that we see. I'll start small, start in Hawaii. And so we can see what's going on here, what kind of data there is, what trends have been looking like in terms of climate change, where we think they're going, zoom out to global, and then to the Paris Agreement and what that means. So this, again, just is the Pacific RISA program. It's a NOAA-sponsored 5-year interdisciplinary grant. We have a lot of partnerships that go, and there are a lot of PIs within, or investigators within that grant. It's based at the East-West Center, but again, we have people at, professors at UH, collaborators at the Climate Science Center, at the PIXI, at the USGS, so we're very collaborative and partnership-based. This is an image that we made for the 2014 National Climate Assessment, and this was in our regional chapter that we submitted to the U.S. National Climate Assessment, and it really just summarized the different kinds of indicators, physical climate indicators we see that show how the climate is changing specifically for the Pacific Islands region. So we have things that are globally significant, so things like carbon dioxide concentrations rising. Of course, we have the longest continuous record of global carbon dioxide concentrations being measured on the Big Island, things like surface air temperatures rising, not only here but around the world, and then things that are very specific to the islands. For example, in Hawaii, we see our base flow, which is the groundwater component of stream flow. We see that decreasing significantly in the last century or so. We see our ocean heat content rising a lot, our sea surface temperatures rising a lot, and sea levels, of course, rising all over the world. We're about on par with average sea level rise in Hawaii, but in the Western Pacific, they have some of the highest rates in the world, or the highest rates in the past 15, 20 years. So if you want some kind of background information on more technical climate information, you can download our 200-page report that was for the National Climate Assessment. We're working on another one now, but this is all freely downloadable. There's also stories, so case studies looking at specific impacts of climate change on different sectors, agriculture, water, things like that. And then an 8-page executive summary for the busy professional who doesn't have time for 200 pages. But one of the biggest good things that came out of this report is that there's a comprehensive literature list at the end, so you can find any technical resource you need and then find those people. It's all very place-based, so all the scientists are based in the region. And then additionally, everyone was involved in putting the information into the chapters. So there are over 100 authors in each of the chapters, and it's a very consensus-based document, so which gives it a lot of weight. So looking at the IPCC, the AR5, which was the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that just came out, the newest one in 2014, how does that differ from the last one 5 years before that in 2007, or AR4? So the attribution statements are really the thing that I wanted to focus in on, which is attribution of why are we seeing these global average rises in temperature. So in 2007, the IPCC said most of the observed increase in global average temperature since the mid-20th century is very likely, which they defined as a 90% confidence, due to the observed increase in anthropogenic greenhouse gases, which means human-produced greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide, methane, things like that. Now, what they changed it to in the last one, the AR5 in 2014, was saying it is extremely likely, 95% confidence, that more than half of the observed increase in global average surface temperature in the last 60 years or so is caused by this anthropogenic greenhouse gas and other anthropogenic forcings. So so this is actually a big deal, even though it's all hidden in scientific jargon and confidence intervals. But that's a huge statement coming from hundreds and hundreds of climate scientists. And basically, that 5% increase and that increased, those additional words mean that the estimated human-caused trend is 100% of the observed trend. So that's basically saying this is not natural that we're seeing. So what we would expect to see if it was a natural temperature rise, we're not seeing. We're seeing this different trend that we see in the models when we replicate that. So this was the latest predicted global climate warming figure that the IPCC produced. Basically, though, we're saying, so this is a bunch of different scenarios that look at different warming based on how we might develop on a global scale. So what kind of energy futures we invest in, how connected we are as a society. But even if we kept our carbon dioxide emissions at the levels they were in the year 2000, there would still be residual warming because there is that feedback effect. The question is how much the eventual temperature rise will be. And so far, it's worth noting that climate scientists have underestimated the rise in almost every single climate variable. We're a conservative people. So I guess if there are people in the class, and if people have questions, feel free to interrupt at any time. But if anybody has a guess which track we're currently on in terms of the colors of these future scenarios, everyone probably has a guess, and they're probably right. It's the red one, the worst case, RCP 8.5, which is basically saying we keep doing what we're doing. So the Paris Agreement is important because it takes us down to, and what they want us to keep is that 2-degree Celsius rise. So by the 2100, they want us to be here, where this orange line is, RCP 6.0, instead of this much greater 4.0 degrees Celsius increase. So looking at some of the observations we see in Hawaii now, something we do see is air temperature here is rising. We see average, minimum, maximum air temperatures rising in the past 100 years. We see it accelerating in the past 30 years. You can see that in the red dots in the graphs, the past 30 years of more rapid increase. And then we also see in high elevation stations, so at weather stations about half a mile above sea level, that temperature is increasing even faster. So places where we have most of our most endangered plants and animals, where they take those refuge up at the high elevations, those are warming the fastest, which is alarming. We also see that rainfall and drought patterns are changing. And so this is observed data, not projected data. So we're seeing in the past 30 years especially, annual precipitation across the state on an annual basis is decreasing significantly. And this one is a projection saying that in the past 30 years, the color map, all Hawaiian islands have experienced greater numbers of consecutive dry days, which is an indicator of drought. And they see that, so the color map shows projected drought risk from 2080 to 2100, so at the end of the century. And so areas in red are showing increased drought risk relative to the past 30 years. So you can see most of those places are in red. As I said before, we also see base flow, that groundwater component of stream flow, decreasing over the past century or so on 8 out of 9 long-term stream gauges across the main islands. Some other impacts, we know that coastal and pelagic fisheries are going to shift. So this is a projection looking out at the end of the century, looking at primary production, how ocean temperatures are going to shift habitats. We don't really know. It's very interconnected, uncertain. But this is a model showing how the ocean might change in productivity. Now what we're going to see is some countries' fisheries are going to prosper from the shifts and some will be negatively impacted. We don't know exactly how that'll play out, so it's a big question mark. We also see threats to coral reefs. Of course, one of the most significant, if not the most significant, coral bleaching event in history is going on right now. I just saw something extremely sobering that said that I think it was 93% of the Great Barrier Reef is in severe bleaching right now, which is shocking. So this is predicting that, so that top map is in 2030 and the bottom is 2050. These are projections of future reef bleaching at an annual scale. So how likely it is that reefs in these environments will bleach annually, but in these years. And you can see by 2050, pretty much every reef having location in the ocean is predicted to bleach annually. Now, corals can come back from bleaching events. So it's not the end of the line necessarily, but when they're stressed again and again, year after year, coupled with increased acidification of oceans, it becomes much less likely that they're going to be able to regain that health. We also see sea level rising, one of the biggest impacts we worry about on the islands. So this is observations showing since the 1990s the rate of globally average sea level rise. What we see in that map is that over the past 15 years, the warm colors show that the highest level of sea level rise in the world being in the Western Pacific. Now, a lot of this is because of the trade winds. It's natural. But all that water has to go somewhere. So if the winds weaken in the future, we might see that slosh back over to the west coast of the U.S. It might hang out in Hawaii. We don't quite know where it's going to go, but we do know that the water has to go somewhere, and it's going to keep on rising. So in terms of projections, we have a couple different trends. This is from the National Climate Assessment, the U.S. National Climate Assessment, and it basically says if it's just based on the historical trends and we don't include any warming at all, we have an 8-inch rise just because it continues out. But if we look at the highest projected sea level rise, which is 6.6 feet, which includes warming, ice sheet loss, and glacial melt, we get to 2.0 meters, or 6.6 feet by the end of the century. Now, Hawaii at this point is on par with those global averages. Now, in terms of climate projections for Hawaii, we're just starting to get a lot of downscaled climate information coming out of the models. What we see so far, and these are hot off the presses, they're not all published yet, is that we see temperature increases at all elevations, most at the high elevations. That's with high confidence, and we see that both in the trends that I showed you and in these future model projections. We see windward sides getting wetter during the wet season, and dry regions mix, some getting much wetter and some getting much drier. Generally, we've seen an increase of mean annual rainfall, which may seem counterintuitive given that we've seen this 30-year drying trend. However, it does make sense physically looking at the increased energy we're putting into the atmosphere and where they look at tropical and subtropical rainfall around the world as increasing in global warming situations. Basically, the question is when we get out of our climate variability hump and get into that global warming increase trend. So we'll probably change from a drier Hawaii to a wetter Hawaii sometime in the next couple decades. or wetter overall, but we will see more drought and more flooding. I'll keep on going for now. We don't have these all consolidated in one place at the moment, but soon at the regional climate website, perca.org, which is in development, will show the most recent up-to-date information. So some questions that we get are, we have all these projections, we have all these scenarios of low, medium, high, sea level rise, for example. When do we know which one of those trajectories we're on? When can we say we're on that worst case red scenario as opposed to an orange? And it's difficult because there's not going to be a moment that we know what trajectory we're on. And as I said, scientists are very conservative in making projections. It's beat into us during our graduate school. But models are still under-predicting observed sea level rise. So not even into the future, but what we're seeing now, they're still under-predicting it. And so what you can do to kind of figure out where we might be on our trajectory in terms of warming is look for some big events that might be happening. So we've seen accelerated ice sheet melt from Greenland. If half of Antarctica falls off, that's going to be a bad sign. We're going to know that this is one of the more worst case scenarios. So look for these big events, and that might give you a hint. If things stabilize, maybe we're on a better trajectory. So something interesting as well is FEMA maps, or emergency management. This determines a lot of floodplains where people live, where people build on the coast and inland. FEMA does not currently incorporate future projections of sea level rise into those maps. Those maps influence insurance, things like that. And it looks like in the future they're going to try to, but it's been very difficult for them to work that information into their policy in a regulatory way. After Hurricane Sandy, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and FEMA created a non-regulatory sea level rise tool for New York City and New Jersey, and that's the first one that I know of that actually incorporates future levels of sea level rise into planning. And that's kind of based on, it recommends planning based on your risk tolerance. So if you have a very highly sensitive system, use a high sea level rise scenario to plan. And if you have a less vulnerable system, use a low scenario to plan. One of the other big impacts that has been looked at and included in the Paris agreements is that climate change is going to force human migration. One of the interesting policy aspects is that no single legal entity governs climate migrants. So, for example, if the people are fleeing from a violent conflict, we have the Geneva Convention that protects their rights. However, with climate migration, there is no international body that gives people different types of rights. And it's a highly uncertain enterprise. So current projections of global climate migrants by mid-century only, 2050, range from 25 million to 1 billion, which is a huge factor of uncertainty. And one of my colleagues, Maxine Burkett, who's a lawyer at the law school and does some work on human migration from climate, says, think of being told, we're going to have a dinner party, and it's either going to have 10 people or 1,000 people. So just plan for that. So it's a lot of uncertainty, and we really don't know what to do at this point about it. But we have to start working out some sort of international legal framework to handle the possible mass movement of a lot of people. Something that sets Pacific Islands apart, of course, is that many won't be able to migrate domestically. In atoll nations, the entire country is only a few feet above sea level. So when sea level rises, the aquifers are salted. There's a lot of question about where people will go and what type of rights they retain in their countries. And then there's the question of equity. So the emitters and the people paying for adaptations and mitigations, and the people getting the impacts so far of the mass number of impacts from climate change. So this kind of wonky looking map is showing, it's a map of the world, a political map of the world, and it resizes countries according to their carbon dioxide emissions. And I believe this was 2009, yeah. It'd be interesting to see what it looks like now, but this was the latest one I could find of this type of map. And so this has, of course, it looks very different than what we're used to. The United States over there in the blue on the left is all blown up and fat because we're a big carbon dioxide emitter. China in the bright green is all blown up. Japan is all blown up. And then sub-Saharan Africa, as you would expect, is shrunk to almost nothing. Almost the entire continent of Africa is shrunk. So this is kind of what we're dealing with in terms of what countries are emitting the most carbon dioxide, at least of 2009. Now this map resizes it by the number of participants at the 2010 UN climate conference. So it's a very different kind of map. Suddenly Africa is visible. We have more participants appearing from places that are more highly impacted. So island nations become much bigger in Southeast Asia, Indonesia. You can see a lot of the countries suddenly appearing. And China and the United States kind of shrink compared to everybody else. So what we have are the emitters traditionally not showing up in as much force to participate in dealing with the impacts. So that's kind of an interesting series of maps. And again, it would be interesting after this climate conference in the Paris and the signing to see what it looks like now. But this was what we were dealing with as recently as 2010, which is not so long ago. So in terms of policy, what do we have to represent small island states, not just Hawaii, but of course throughout the region? There are a lot of small island states with not a lot of population, but that are disproportionately impacted. So what we have, for one, is the Alliance of Small Island States, or AOSIS. The Coalition of Small Island States is global. There are 44 island states that currently belong to it. They're a diplomatic mission to the UN based in New York City, and that kind of based around the fact that islands are a small cause of the problem of global warming and emissions, but they have a disproportionately large exposure to impacts. One of the major things that happened in last September was a Suva Declaration, which was signed in Fiji at the Pacific Islands Development Forum, which was basically a collective voice saying that, or demanding that more must be done to mitigate climate impacts the world has caused for Pacific Islands, and that the 2 °C warming that people were advocating for on a policy scale was too little too late. The worst impacts were still going to cause irreparable harm to island countries for a 2-degree rise, and that they were actually shooting for a 1.5 °C rise. And this is an old slide where I said it will be presented, but it was presented to the COP21 leaders in Paris. And some of that language made it in, and I'll also show exactly what that language was in a minute. But they were a very strong voice and had been called kind of the moral center of the Paris arguments. So the COP21, the UN Conference on Climate Change, or the Conference of Parties, the 21st one of these suckers, happened in Paris, France in November and December of 2015. There were over 40,000 participants, and the goal was to achieve a new and legally binding international agreement on the climate. Keyword legally binding in red and italics there, because no one's ever tried to make it legally binding before. No one would even sign it before, really. So with the aim of keeping global warming below 2°C, and of course this is a mitigation step, not an adaptation step. So trying to stop the problem instead of deal with the problem, or the impacts of the problem. The new instrument, the goal of the legally binding instrument, will be adopted in 2016 and implemented from 2020 out, or sooner if possible. What happened in terms of the language of warming, it came out as they want to keep global warming well below 2°C. So they didn't go as far as to define what that number would be. But they acknowledged that they wanted it well below 2 degrees. So that was about as strong as it got, which I was still impressed with because everyone's been pretty dysfunctional for 20 other of these conference of parties. So the UN Framework on Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC, for instance, comparing it to the COP21, was in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. You may remember that one. That one, where they were in 1992, was they signed that they agreed that anthropogenic climate change was real. Of course, we're not all on that same page yet, but they were there back in 92. And they said it was the major responsibility of the industrialized countries to combat it, and that decisions could only be made if all parties agreed. And of course, that's where everything has fallen apart for the last 20 years. So for an example, what kinds of pledges and goals, and I guess that Josh will be discussing some of these sustainability pledges later with you, but for example, the types of things that countries have pledged for the COP21 include 130 governments, companies, and groups have pledged to have deforestation by 2020 and to end it by 2030. These are very lofty goals. More than 20 governments and 30 organizations and companies announced that they would join the Global Alliance for Climate Smart Agriculture. Those are practices that decrease greenhouse emissions from agriculture, both in no-till technologies, keeping the soil healthier, and less mass kind of industrial agriculture. The mayors of more than 2,000 cities around the world have entered into a compact to curb greenhouse gas emissions by 454 megatons by 2020, which is huge. And the goal, again, is to mobilize $100 billion a year to provide financial support for developing countries, including a lot of island countries, to mitigate and adapt to climate change. And then that image on the right, the figure shows emissions in 1990 versus 2012 by countries. So you can kind of see things have gotten more equal in a way, but also balanced out so that there are more emitters, of course, as more people join the more developed world. So today, Earth Day, a both symbolic and important an important day in terms of the Paris Agreement. The UN is asking 155 countries to sign the Climate Accord. Immediate or early ratifying countries have included a lot of the small island states: Fiji, Tuvalu, Kiribati, the Maldives, Samoa, a couple more, and I'm sure things are happening right now that I don't know about that's going on live. What does that mean, though? They're signing it. That means they're ratifying it. But to make this agreement work, it still has to be ratified by enough countries that represent at least 55% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, and it has to be translated to action. And that's difficult. The deadline for ratifying these agreements is 1 year from today. And so this is, again, the agreement that came out of the Paris talks. Now all the countries have to sign it. So traditionally, the US and China have always stood in the way, but they're signing it this time, which is a huge step. You saw those giant bubbles of emitters as countries. Having the US and China not sign is a huge impediment to any sort of mitigation on a global scale and preventing a lot of the worst impacts from global warming. So what about the US ratifying this agreement, this climate accord? So Obama is likely going to try and use an executive order to get it ratified before he leaves office, because there is very little chance that the US Congress will ratify the accord. So he's probably going to try and bypass them. In terms of politically and governance, what that means, I don't have the expertise to really comment on it, other than saying this is probably the only way to get the US to sign that agreement. So lastly, is the climate accord, the UN climate accord, symbolic? Or does it actually do something? Well, number one is yes, of course it's symbolic. It's, this is a global agreement, the first one we've had with the largest emitters coming together. I can't stress enough how huge the Paris Agreement really was in terms of people coming together and finally admitting on paper that there was a problem. So yes, it's symbolic and it's very strong, but at the same time it's also binding. They want people to actually follow through on their pledges, and they're going to check up on them. So I think 2018 is the first time that people are going to go in and look at those pledges and evaluate how well they've been doing. And then they'll do that every couple of years after that, and people can reevaluate their goals and modify their emissions after that point. So it's a big day today, but the next year is going to be equally as important. And then the next couple of years, while people actually start implementing those pledges, are going to be crucial in terms of keeping the limit below 2 degrees and actually getting something done. So with that, here are a couple links that you might find interesting. The UN Paris, the PERCA report with our regional climate projections and interesting things. The NOAA sea level rise viewer, you can pump up sea level rise and see what it's doing to our coasts, and the grant that I'm on, the Pacific RESA. And with that, I will open it up for discussion or questions.
Mahalo, Victoria. Thank you very much. And even though you said you weren't policy-oriented, it was very policy-oriented.
I tried.
With a lot of important aspects, and definitely touching on a lot of the main points. And I think the reason that you said, we'll see if it's historic is, the one historic thing is there's a signing rising, like sea level rising, that normally it trickles in. And that on the opening day, to have over 150, especially
huge.
U.S. and China, is important. But as we all know, unfortunately with politics, things don't ever really happen unless we keep pushing. So that's one of the best parts of seeing what's possible, and how the Oasis, as you pointed out, was doing a really good job, and the ability of Pacific Island states to organize and be able to put pressure was important in Paris. I can say that from being there and seeing the way that the negotiations took place. So we'll open it up to questions first, if there's any questions from any of the islands. Right now, the closing ceremonies actually did start, so we'll get back to that, but want to definitely take questions while Victoria's here, and appreciate her time.
I'd like to have a question.
Sure.
My question is that, today we realize that global warming and sea level rise is a very significant environmental and coastline problem. Here in Hawaii, however, our bigger problem is the fact that we have thousands of Micronesians coming to Hawaii as refuge from losing their homeland, yet the state of Hawaii, in their brilliance of legislative ability, decided to kill Medicaid for these people. They do not get federal Medicaid because of the 1997 Welfare Reform Act, which had nothing to do with Micronesians. What kind of things are we going to be able to do to face the impact of this population of Micronesians who don't have insurance arriving in Hawaii?
So that's out of my expertise area, but I can say before I let Josh butt in is that I was sitting on a climate change and human health working group at the Hawaii Department of Health, and looking at impacts on migration and the immigration of Micronesians into Hawaii, and the healthcare system was something they were very concerned about and looking at. So they've started doing the analysis in terms of cutting the coverage. I can't speak to that. It doesn't seem like it was a great idea, of course, but we are dealing with the re-signing of the Compact of Free Association as well, which is coming up, I think, in 2018. So there are countries that are talking about pulling out of the compact, which would put a lot of the benefits in question as well.
I'd say the one thing that links with, there we go. The one thing that definitely links with is how all the human rights related to climate change are being impacted. So the first one, of course, is self-determination, that if it's really an existential issue for many Pacific Island states because their homelands would cease to exist. But then it also shows how it's not 30 years from now, but now. And on this issue, it's water is a very important issue. If the water is contaminated with salinization, of course, that's huge. Also with the droughts that Victoria shared as well, but also the right to food. A lot of the salinization of the fresh water then impacts the traditional crops such as kalo and taro. And then, of course, it goes to right to health, as people will import. And since you did bring up Micronesia, I think it also links another important issue that, 60 years ago, Pacific Islanders were kind of put on the altar of sacrifice in the name of security. And now, this many years later, Pacific Islanders are, just because people want to have a certain lifestyle, even though we know it's harming people, now they're being sacrificed again. But what's exciting is to see the way 350.org and Pacific Islanders are organizing together to stand up for their rights today and now. So it is an important issue. And there's lots of other aspects of how all these issues are connected around Oceania. Any questions from Maui? And I think we also have a speaker from Maui who was also in Paris maybe, but are there any questions from Maui first?
No, we're good. Thanks.
Okay. All right. So maybe what we'll do now then is I see our speaker who was also in Paris, I believe, right? And so we'll hand over to her to be able to share a little bit about her story and the amazing experience she had being in Paris up through December 12th on the actual day the agreement was reached. And then we'll go live to New York after that. But I'm very happy to have you there and really good to see you and glad you can participate. Mahalo.
Okay, I'm kind of new to this technology, so it's a little bit unnerving, I would say.
You're doing fine. And look, it's lower carbon because we're not flying between the islands.
True story. Yeah, so my name is Kylea Fredrick. I grew up here on the island of Maui. And I actually need to leave at 1 o'clock, so I have like 15 minutes. Yeah, so our story, well, my story actually started in 2013. I attended a program in Sweden for international young adults. And it was a program in social entrepreneurship and planetary stewardship. And I promised myself that if I had the opportunity to attend a program like this, that I was wanting to make opportunity for other young adults here in the islands to go abroad and have other experiences, in other places. So this whole Paris thing came up. I had known about it for I think 2 years before, but I didn't really know much about the Conference of Parties and what it fully entailed, and I actually didn't know that it was that people from off the grounds could just go and participate in different ways. I had no idea civil society was a major part of the participation, and so I never contemplated going myself. But in the fall, there was a few people here on the island that had found out about COP21, and they knew that as civil society we could go, and they wanted to put together a delegation of youth from Maui to go over. And so someone came to me and they asked if I would like to be one of these young people, and so I said yes, and then I was like, let's find some other local Hawaiian youth, because it's really important to me that there gets to be a few more of us. And so we were 5 young people from Maui in total, and then we had 3 supporting people that were there just to make sure that, we were able to like catch all of our trains and stay on track and translate everything for us, because none of us spoke French. Yeah, so I was there a little bit over 3 weeks. It was a really intensive experience. We were staying in a hostel that had turned into a press release hub. And so every morning we would get up and go downstairs and eat breakfast with like crazy cameras around us and people having these interviews and all of these different heads of state. And it was kind of just like a whirlwind, like nonstop for about, it was like 25 days or so. And just kind of like catching trains every single day all over the city. So what it actually looks like on the ground if you don't have accreditation, and none of us actually had accreditation, is there's what's called the blue zone, which is for different government officials to show up and actually talk about like what this room looks like that Josh is pulling up here. So they're sitting in spaces like this. And then there's everyone else, so just people like you and me, and they have a public zone called the green zone for us, but where I actually didn't spend so much time, because every time there is a conference of parties and it takes place in a city, that entire city kind of lights up, and there's just everything going on every single possible subject from so many different countries and organizations. They all kind of have little areas that they're holding space for around the city. And so we just traveled around the city and met a lot of different people and many different organizations, and mainly spent a lot of time listening. Yeah, as Victoria was kind of highlighting earlier, there's, I would say like a very big turnout regarding Pacific Islanders and indigenous peoples from other parts of the world, mainly because they are communities that are impacted first or are dealing with really big companies in their backyards that are literally taking land away from them in front of their faces and sometimes also threatening their lives. So it was a really amazing opportunity to really just listen to people's stories and yeah, really like step into, I would say, more of a knowing rather than a feeling that something is really big and wrong. So that was December. We got home. And we were funded by the community to do this adventure. We've had to crowdfund $20,000. That was like our plane tickets and all of our accommodation and food. And with a very specific kind of agreement, I would say, with our larger community that if we were to go and have this experience, that we would come home and share this information, whatever it was that we had collected, whatever stories it was that we had heard, with whoever is around us. And so, yeah, it was kind of this like, I gave myself like 3 weeks when I got home to like sleep and eat and be a human being again. Just kind of like thinking about what I wanted to do, yeah, how I wanted to pay back my community. So I actually am running a course right now called Earth is Ohana. It's a 10-week course it's actually a closed group, so we meet every single week, every Thursday, so yesterday, from 4 to 6 p.m. And it's an integration, I would say, of 3 basic pillars. So we work with looking at like a practical idea of how some of these larger ideas can be implemented on a very local level. And we look at what it feels like to have a reconnection again with our biosphere or with just nature in general. And we're also trying to understand through a more academic lens what is happening. So the two, I would say, major frameworks that we're working with are spiritual ecology, and that kind of covers like the spiritual, like a spiritual and religious response that's a little bit also more philosophical. And then we also work with the planetary boundaries framework, which is being kind of like further developed and brought out on a global scale through the Stockholm Resilience Center. So these, I would say, are kind of like my 2 areas of personal interest and study. And yeah, it's been really fun. Like it's in some ways it's been very experimental, and I'm happy. We're about halfway through now, and I'm really happy with like the outcome of what it is to sit with a group of people and really kind of dive into some of these larger issues, and to acknowledge that sometimes there is fear and major questions on a very personal level. But it's okay, It's so, I feel like we're finding solidarity in this group together. And then my work kind of just will keep continuing. I'm a spiritual ecology youth fellow. That my fellowship begins in the summer, so I will be further like researching and developing in the field of spiritual ecology with other. I think we're 12 people, so 11 other young adults from around the country, and yeah, so we've been chosen to partake in this fellowship and kind of keep seeing like what are possible innovative responses that we can bring to our local communities and I guess nationwide. Yeah, so that's kind of like I would say like my next step after this little project that I'm working on right now. Yeah, and I like to show up to little things like these and just like listen, and I find these fields really fascinating. I think this is like one of the most amazing and exciting times to be alive, and yeah, I feel really fortunate. Yeah.
Great, wow, you did great. Way to tackle technology. And so it's great to also see our youth that were also in Paris. We had a small delegation from Hawaii Institute for Human Rights that went to Paris, and we had people all over, and exactly as she described it, when you're in Paris, it was just nonstop. It's just weeks of not sleeping and going to negotiations and following language and bracketed text and trying to get certain things in that we know would be essential to move beyond for the next step. And yes, it's great when your hostel turns into the International Press Conference, because you just run into so many different people. I think that's probably one of the best aspects of the global conference, which Victoria showed, the swelling of people from all over the world who are actually directly impacted today, and not waiting for the larger countries who are the big emitters to do something about it, but taking the actions by themselves and connecting and networking that way. Is there any questions for our speaker, or maybe is there one aspect of maybe what was one of the highlights of Paris for you? Was there a speaker that you got to go see in the blue and the green or whatever zone it was? Or was there a direct action that took place that you appreciated or that kind of inspired you that was like, this is why I'm in Paris at all by any chance?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I'm a really big fan of Democracy Now! I feel like it's like a news source that I really enjoy because we get like a rounded perspective on different issues that are like relevant now. And so at my hostel, one evening, Amy Goodman came, and it was just like one of these like, it was just like one of probably the highlights of my whole life. Like I got to be like less than 5 feet away from her. I was like crouched on the ground, like on this like makeshift stage, and it was Amy Goodman, and she had actually just come from the refugee camp that was out on like the outskirts of Paris, and she just has like an amazing way of taking different issues that seem like very maybe separate, or sometimes we're slow in regular society, I guess, to draw connections and create the connections for us. So essentially talking about how all of these refugees are, you know, on the outskirts of Paris, what it actually looks like there in the refugee camp, and actually how like major, you know, these countries that are in major conflict, oftentimes it's because of changing climate, such as desertification, lack of water, that these major uproars happen and people go into like mass just anger, and it's difficult, you know, these big things. Yeah, she was amazing. It was like, I would say the only time I have ever listened to a speaker where no one wanted to applaud in between the moments when she had a pause or wanted to drink water, because to applaud would mean that maybe we would miss a moment of anything she had to say. So it was like a very quieted space of many people, and a lot of people just like crying around me because it was big. Yeah.
No, I remember that. It was quite a big one, and I've run into her a couple times as well in Cancun and in Durban, and she's probably one of the few American journalists that goes to the conference and then gets the people's perspective around the planet about what climate change means, as opposed to just getting the quotes from the heads of state. So really glad you're able to experience that. And then I know you have to go, so I'll respect your time. I see it's at 57 or 58 after. So we really do want to thank you for coming. Hopefully also in the fall, the IUCN Global Conference will be taking place on Oahu, and that'll be on the 2nd of September. So what we're going to do is have a similar event. So we'll have at least 15 different indigenous leaders from Africa, Asia, the Pacific, that'll be on Oahu, and we want to have the event as well. So you can mark your calendar. I know it's really far ahead, but you know, we can coordinate together with the class that you're running to make sure that we're able to bring everyone together, at least on a monthly basis, to continue this conversation. And since you're doing so well with technology now, you probably shouldn't stop. You'll be able to do all kinds of great things with it. But thank you so much for showing up, and it's great to see you, even though we weren't able to meet. It's great to be able to meet this way, and hopefully we'll be able to meet you on Maui one day, or over when you're on Oahu.
Thank you.
All right, so mahalo. So what we'll go to now is just the videos that actually just were taking place. So the first one I thought we would look at is the closing ceremony just concluded, actually, but we didn't want to interrupt Victoria's speech. But here's some of the speeches that were going on today, and they're just short ones, but they're really good to see where we're at.
Excellencies, readers and gentlemen,
Is it possible to say one more thing?
Introducing the Secretary General
Right
of
after
the
this video,
United
it's fine.
Nations. Thank you.
This one video, if that's okay.
Son Excellence,
Your Excellency, Mr. François Hollande, President of the Republic of France. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished heads of state and government. Your Royal Highness, Princess Lala Hasna of the Kingdom of Morocco. Your Excellency, Ms. Ségolène Royal, President of COP21. Ms. Christiana Figueres, Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests and performers, ladies and gentlemen. Last December in Paris, the international community adopted the world's first universal climate agreement. Every country pledged to curb emissions and to strengthen resilience to potentially devastating climate impacts. Today, at least 171 countries have gathered here in New York to sign the Paris Agreement. Let us stand back and take this in for just a moment. This is history in the making. This is the largest number of countries ever to sign an international agreement on a single day. I congratulate all those who are signing this morning, and I especially commend the 15 parties who are also going to deposit their instruments of ratification today. And I would like to recognize them by name: Barbados, Belize, Fiji, Grenada, Maldives, the Marshall Islands, Mauritius, Nauru, Palau, the State of Palestine, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, Samoa, Somalia, and Tuvalu. Congratulations, one and all. The spirit of solidarity of Paris still lives.
Excellencies, distinguished heads of state and government, honorable ministers, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, we are breaking records in this chamber, and that is good news. But records are also being broken outside. Record global temperatures, record ice loss, record carbon levels in the atmosphere. We are in a race against time. I urge all countries to move quickly to join the agreement at the national level so that the Paris Agreement can enter into force as early as possible. The window for keeping global temperature rise well below 2 degrees Celsius, let alone 1.5 degrees, is rapidly closing. The area of consumption without consequences is over. We must intensify efforts to decarbonize our economies. We must support developing countries in making this transition. The poor and most vulnerable must not suffer further from a problem they did not create. Let us never forget, climate action is not a burden. Indeed, it offers many benefits. It can help us eradicate poverty, create green jobs, defeat hunger, prevent instability, and improve the lives of girls and women. Climate action is essential to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, many people contributed to the COP21 negotiations in Paris and to the preparations for this event. I acknowledge their tireless efforts particularly the work of the UNFCCC Secretariat. Today is a day that I have worked toward since day one as a Secretary General of the United Nations and declared climate change to be my top priority. Today, you are signing new covenant with the future. This covenant must amount to more than promises. It must find expressions in actions we take today on behalf of this and all future generations, actions that reduce climate risk and protect communities, and actions that place us on a safer, a smarter path. This morning, we will be joined by 197 children representing the parties that adopted the Paris Agreement. Of course, they represent more than this. These young people are our future. Our covenant is with them. Today is a day for our children and grandchildren and all generations to come. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, together, let us turn the aspirations of Paris into action. As we show by the very act of signing today, the power to build a better world is in your hands. Thank you very much for your leadership and commitment. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Okay, so I think Hilo had a point they wanted to say before the video. We just wanted to let the video play though first, but go ahead.
Thank you very much. I have to leave as well. I'm a Marshallese interpreter. I have a patient that I have to be ready for. But before I leave, I just want to see if I can ask something of each of you who are joining us today, because I don't know who to ask for help. There is a healthcare crisis for Micronesians that is going to happen in November. Most of the Micronesians are on welfare or don't make very much money. They don't have any, normally, they don't have any need to turn in tax forms. If they are not aware of this, and most of the connector people that were with Hawaii Connector did not receive their 1095 forms, so if they don't put that form with their tax return, even if they don't make any money, they will not be allowed to sign up for Obamacare or the ACA program next year, which is sign up in November. The reason why I'm asking you to help is because I would hope that each and every one of you would seek out a senator or a representative state senator or a representative, or even the federal representatives and senators, to try to find out a way to deal with this problem before, in November or in December or January of next year, thousands of Micronesians will only have emergency rooms for health care. This is a severe problem, and as Ban Ki-moon just said, the smallest of the poorest of the people should not be paying the price for this. And in Hawaii, we made a bad decision by taking them off of state Medicaid, but since that happened, we should redo the Welfare Reform Act and change the one word, because it used to read that Micronesians are eligible for Medicaid, and it now reads that they are not. So this is something that is political, but it has to do with the climate change, and your help would be greatly appreciated. I can't do this by myself.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you also for taking time out of your busy schedule doing important healthcare as a human rights work. Also, there's one more point I guess we could share with you as well, is we also have a resolution. We have a House resolution locally 69, and it's actually hasn't been heard yet. And of course, we all know that the legislative session at the State House level ends very soon in early May. So the resolution is to actually have Hawaii adopt the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which looks at health, which also looks at climate change, which looks also at ending poverty. So if you call, it's Representative Ito, I-T-O, and that's on the VMI, Veterans, Military, and International Affairs Committee. They haven't had a hearing yet. So if you just call Representative Ito today and ask for him to have a hearing on UN Sustainable Development Goals, it fits very much in with all the issues we've been discussing with the January event, the February event, the March event that we did that focused more on gender on International Women's Day. But if we don't make calls, they probably won't have the hearing. So it's good to remind us to be politically active and to take a small amount of action that'll have a big impact. So thank you very much there. What we'll do then with the last couple of minutes is there's a handful of very important videos, some of them from ambassadors of climate justice. Others are actually advocates from Africa that we work with on indigenous rights. So we just thought we'd show a couple. The next one
I
would
did
be,
want to just make one more statement.
Okay.
I'm sorry to bother you. We did have a simple survey downstairs at the Earth Day here at UH, and the project that we did, the UNA association here, we asked people to select which sustainable goal that they were most associated with or felt was most important, and the hands down winner was life underwater. So from Hawaii, life underwater, I forget the number, but that's the goal that won today's survey. I've got to go. Thank you very much for all your help.
That's no problem, and not at all an interruption in that Hawaii has actually been accepted to be the only U.S. state that's going to have its own website at the United Nations under the World We Want. So all the other countries that are signing today, as you point out, over 171, the Hawaii will have a Hawaii We Want website. And the exciting thing is the Hawaii We Want will actually be featured. And so next time, if you do it electronically, we'll actually be able to record those results and send that in. But we're actually doing a UN program that's actually going to be connected to the Department of Public Information 66 NGO conference in Seoul, Korea. And it's a global consultation up until May 2nd. So I'll forward that to you as well so you could add the votes of the people of Hilo at the Earth Day conference downstairs. We think it's great that Hilo's participating at the Earth Day conference, and so are we. We also have a Model United Nations conference today. We're going to have an intercollegiate Model UN with UH West Oahu, BYU, Hawaii Pacific University, and UH Manoa at the law school. So we think it's great that everyone's involved and that they could take time out and be able to connect in between the islands. Last night we're also at BYU, and we actually connected with students from Palau, Nauru, Papua New Guinea, Tuvalu, and Kiribati, who are also working on this project and will be participating on climate justice as well. So not an interruption at all. Thank you very much. And then now we'll show the film from Leonardo DiCaprio.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General, for the honor to address this body once more. And thanks to the distinguished climate leaders assembled here today who are ready to take action. President Abraham Lincoln was also thinking of bold action 150 years ago when he said, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country." He was speaking before the U.S. Congress to confront the defining issue of his time, slavery. Everyone knew it had to end, but no one had the political will to stop it. Remarkably, his words ring as true today when applied to the defining crisis of our time, climate change. As a UN messenger of peace, I have traveled all over the world for the last 2 years documenting how this crisis is changing the natural balance of our planet. I have seen cities like Beijing choked by industrial pollution, ancient boreal forests in Canada that have been clear-cut, and rainforests in Indonesia that have been incinerated. In India, I met farmers whose crops have been literally washed away by historic flooding. In America, I have witnessed unprecedented droughts in California and sea level rise flooding the streets of Miami. In Greenland and in the Arctic, I was astonished to see that ancient glaciers are rapidly disappearing well ahead of scientific predictions. All that I have seen and learned on my journey has absolutely terrified me. There is no doubt in the world scientific community that this is a direct result of human activity and the effects of climate change will become astronomically worse in the future. I do not need to tell you these statistics. You know them better than I do, but more importantly, you know what will happen if this scourge is left unchecked. You know that climate change is happening faster than even the most pessimistic of scientists warned us decades ago. It has become a runaway freight train, bringing with it an impending disaster for all living things. Now think about the shame that each of us will carry when our children and grandchildren look back and realize that we had the means of stopping this devastation, but simply lacked the political will to do so. Yes, we have achieved the Paris Agreement. More countries have come together here to sign this agreement today than for any other cause in the history of humankind, and that is reason for hope. But unfortunately, the evidence shows us that it will not be enough. Our planet cannot be saved unless we leave fossil fuels in the ground where they belong. An upheaval, a massive change is required right now, one that leads to a new collective consciousness, a new collective evolution of the human race, inspired and enabled by a sense of urgency from all of you. We all know that reversing the course of climate change will not be easy, but the tools are in our hands if we apply them before it is too late. Renewable energy, fossil fuels, and putting a price on carbon pollution are beginning to turn the tide. This transition is not only the right thing for our world, but it also makes clear economic sense and is possible within our lifetime. But it is now upon you to do what great leaders have always done, to lead, to inspire, and empower, as President Lincoln did in his time. We can congratulate each other today, but it will mean absolutely nothing if you return to your countries and fail to push beyond the promises of this historic agreement. Now is the time for bold, unprecedented action. My friends, look at the delegates around you. It is time to ask each other, which side of history will you be on? As a citizen of our planet who has witnessed so much on this journey, I thank you all for everything you have done to lay the foundation of a solution to this crisis. But after 21 years of debates and conferences, it is time to declare no more talk, no more excuses, no more 10-year studies, no more allowing the fossil fuel companies to manipulate and dictate the science and policies that affect our future. This is the body that can do what is needed. All of you sitting in this very hall, the world is now watching. You will either be lauded by future generations or vilified by them. Lincoln's words still resonate to all of us here today. We will be remembered in spite of ourselves. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the last generation. We shall nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope of earth. That is our charge now. You are the last best hope of earth. We ask you to protect it, or we and all living things we cherish are history. Thank you very much.
The last speaker we want to feature is the woman who was actually selected from all the people in the world to share her story. And she's an amazing advocate that I just saw in Brussels in last month. So she'll be speaking now to us about her story.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for this opportunity to speak in this assembly. This assembly who decide war and peace, who has now to decide the survival or the death of my community. My people, the Mbororo community nomadic pastoralists, living around Lake Chad forever. More than 30 million people depend on his fragile ecosystem. 30 years ago, my mother used to walk 10 kilometers a day to collect water and food. Today, the young mothers are about to become climate refugees. They cannot walk to Lake Chad because it's vanishing. Our pasture, our livestock, our food, our land are vanishing. Tension between communities are used by some merchant of death and terror such as Boko Haram. Our basic rights and our dignity are under threat. Climate change is adding poverty to poverty every day, and is forcing man to leave home looking for a better future. Migration is challenging for rich countries, but it's a tragedy for those who are left behind, for those women and children who have to stay and fight back consequences of climate change on their own. When I left Chad last week, my people were facing more than 48 degrees Celsius, which is its 180 degrees Fahrenheit, killing hundreds of them on silence. We fight for survival. Nature is our supermarket. To protect it, we use our indigenous traditional knowledge and science knowledge. We developed participatory 3D mapping project to help the young people and women to manage the few resources left. In another project, we anticipate weather change by use the direction of the wind, cloud observation, birds migration. But our indigenous traditional knowledge cannot solve everything. It cannot end fossil fuel. It cannot protect us from deforestation or land grabbing. السيدات والسادة اليوم تملك.
Ladies and gentlemen, today you have the full responsibility to ensure international citizenship.
Dans ma communauté,
Ladies and gentlemen, in my community, thousands of women and children have never used electricity. I have seen myself the damage caused by fossil fuels, in particular carbon, in the industrialized countries. For us, true climate justice is renewable energy for all.
if you do not increase finance for adaptation, soon there will be no one to adapt. In Paris, you give us hope, but now it's time to change your hope into promise. Trust among nations into change for people. Let us sign this. Let us ratify this. Let us implement this agreement. We are changing. We want you to act. Now it's time to bring a concrete change to the people, to my people in Chad. Thank you.
Perfect. And then this is the final speaker, which should get us right up to the closing time.
Thank you.
Oops. We saw that one. So let's take a moment just maybe to talk UNA. How's everything going with UNA and Hilo? And let's see things that we can do for the fall together. How's everything going today at the fair?
Really well. You know, like I said, we gave out information to people. Oh, many children. We made up some packets for them. It was wonderful. And we've had a really good year. You know, we've had a lecture series of 8 different university professors talking about global issues and have had good attendance at those lectures. And it's been a good year for us. We've been
great.
involved in quite a lot of things.
Let's try to aim for the fall to see if we can have our lectures kind of overlap. And I'll try to do that with our first one on September 2nd, if that sounds good, because we know we'll have a Pacific Island Leaders Summit at the East-West Center, but we'll also have the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and that meeting will be on Oahu, and there'll be a lot of different NGOs as well. So maybe we can advertise it on Maui as well as in Hilo, and we can invite people to attend. But it's great to hear. What were some of the international issues that the different, addressed?
We did climate change, we did sustainable agriculture, we had an economics person talk on economics issues in the future. It was very, very interesting. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, we'll conclude then with our final video, and it's actually the president of the current UN General Assembly, and then we'll see everyone in September and look forward to coordinating then.
And His Excellency Mr. Morens Likatov, President of the General Assembly. Thank you very much.
Heads of State and Government, Mr. Secretary General, Honorable Ministers, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to address the opening segment of this Paris Agreement signing ceremony. This is a moment of great hope. And for that, I say congratulations. Congratulations to heads of state and government for demonstrating what true leadership is all about, for finding a way when many said it could not be done. Congratulations to civil society and business leaders for keeping the pressure on and taking initiatives to keep the momentum going. Congratulations to the governments of France and Peru and previous COP presidents for shepherding through this historic breakthrough with remarkable skill and effort. And to the UN Secretary General, His Excellency Ban Ki-moon, for his tireless commitment and leadership in the long journey to Paris. Together with Christiana Figueres and the UNFCCC and others in the UN system, the Secretary General never once lost hope, never once passed up an opportunity to drive negotiations forward. To honor his work, to make the sacrifices made by all of you worthwhile, we know what must be done. We must raise the level of ambition even further in the years to come. We must take urgent and bold steps to make this transformation happen now. I thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency President of General Assembly for his leadership and statement.
All right, that brings us to the end today, and we'd like to thank everyone for participating. With UNA, one of the goals we're going to look at in the fall is also setting up UNA chapters on all the other campuses as well. So we'll set one up at BYU, we're setting up one at West Oahu, and we have one here at Manoa. So we'll be looking at Maui as well, and I just received a text from the people from Maui that they want to participate in that as well, although they're excited, but they had to leave a little early today. So I want to thank everyone for participating, and happy Earth Day. And more importantly, let's contact our elected officials and keep the pressure on. And we'll let you know how our intercollegiate Model UN works out this afternoon at the law school. So mahalo, and we'll talk to you soon. And one idea we do have is to do the intercollegiate Model UN maybe using HITS and seeing that way if we could have an inter-island model United Nations. So we look forward to coordinating that together. But aloha, Ruth. Thank you so much, and we'll talk next time. Have a great summer, and we'll see you on September 2nd.